5 years ago, my sister stole my fiancé. At our father's retirement banquet, she stood near the towering ice sculpture of a soaring eagle, swirled a glass of vintage champagne in her hand, and laughed loudly enough for the entire table of relatives and local high society guests to hear. Poor Hannah, Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she looked around the table, ensuring she had everyone's attention. Still single, still spending her life in mud, sweat, and combat boots. I guess civilian men just don't want to date their commanding officer. It must be so difficult, Hannah, having to order people around because no one will willingly choose to stand by your side. A woman in camouflage isn't exactly what men dream of bringing home to a nice dinner. A few of my aunts shifted uncomfortably in their cushioned chairs, exchange awkward glances. My mother, Evelyn, immediately looked down at her plate, pretending to adjust her expensive pearl necklace with intense, nervous focus. My father, Colonel Richard Carter, cleared his throat but said nothing, his silence a tacit approval of his favorite daughter's behavior. My sister, Victoria, smiled, that slow, perfectly practiced smile she had used her entire life to charm cameras, sponsors, and rooms full of wealthy Seattle socialites. She looked radiant in her shimmering emerald designer gown, a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of my formal attire. Beside her sat Ryan, her husband, and my former fiancé. He looked tense, his fingers gripping his wine glass so tightly his knuckles were white, his eyes glued to the tablecloth to avoid looking at me. I simply smiled back, my expression calm, measured, and completely unbothered. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, set the crystal glass down on the white tablecloth, and said 4 words. Meet my husband, Victoria. The smile vanished from her face instantly. The smug satisfaction in her eyes turned into deep confusion, her eyebrows knitting together as if I had spoken in a foreign language. You're, what? Victoria sneered, letting out a nervous, sharp laugh. Hannah, please. You don't have to invent a husband just to save face. We all know you haven't been on a date in 5 years. But before she could finish her sentence, the heavy double doors of the country club's grand reception hall opened. A man stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet, undeniable authority that drew the eyes of half the room. He wore a tailored charcoal wool suit that fit his lean frame perfectly. His face was sharp, defined by a strong jawline, and his eyes, calm, piercing, and incredibly intelligent, scanned the room before settling directly on me. The moment Victoria saw his face, her entire body froze. Her hand began to tremble violently. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her face a ghastly, pale white. The crystal champagne glass she had been holding slipped from her fingers. The room went dead silent. The string quartet seemed to fade into nothingness as every head turned toward our table. Victoria's eyes were wide with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and sheer, unadulterated panic. For the first time in her entire life, my golden child sister looked absolutely terrified. You see, some people spend their entire lives running a race, constantly looking over their shoulder to make sure they are winning. But they forget that the past has a way of catching up to you, right when you think you've crossed the finish line. Growing up, Victoria was the unquestioned star of the Carter family. She was beautiful, outgoing, and possessed a natural charm that made people forgive her worst behaviors. My parents, both prominent figures in our wealthy Seattle suburb, absolutely adored her. She was a successful model and fashion influencer, her life displayed in perfect, sun-drenched squares on Instagram. I was the quiet one. The shadow. I inherited my grandmother Eleanor's discipline and quiet strength. While Victoria spent her teenage years attending modeling shoots and being pampered, I found my calling in service. I went to West Point, spent my 20s on deployments, and took command positions in logistics and operations while Victoria traveled to Paris and Milan on my parents' dime. In our household, achievement was expected of me, but celebration was strictly reserved for Victoria. On the day I graduated from West Point, Victoria staged a sudden, dramatic health scare that forced my parents to leave early, missing my commissioning ceremony entirely. When I earned a major military scholarship and was promoted to captain, my father patted my shoulder and said, "Good job, Hannah. Keep focusing. But when Victoria landed a minor regional magazine cover, my parents threw a 70-person cocktail party at our estate. I accepted my role as the shadow. I told myself it didn't matter, that my service and my soldiers were my true reward. But the pattern took a destructive, painful turn 5 years ago. I was engaged to Ryan. We had been together for 3 years, and we were just a month away from our wedding. Ryan was a local real estate developer, charming, successful, and heavily approved of by my parents. I thought I had finally found my own piece of happiness, a sanctuary away from the family drama. One rainy evening, I returned home early from a pre-deployment training exercise at Fort Lewis. I wanted to surprise Ryan with a quiet dinner. Instead, I saw Victoria's sports car parked in my driveway next to Ryan's truck. When I walked into the house, the silence was deafening. I didn't find them discussing wedding plans. I found them together in the living room, sharing an intimacy that was meant only for me and my future husband. The betrayal didn't explode with shouting. It was quiet, cold, and devastatingly clean. Ryan cried, apologizing, saying he had been overwhelmed by my military career, that he felt intimidated by my rank, my strength, and my frequent absences, and that Victoria's free spirit made him feel needed. Victoria, however, never apologized. She stood by the fireplace, crossed her arms, and looked at me with a look of pure triumph. If he really loved you, Hannah, he wouldn't have been so easy to take, she had whispered, making sure Ryan couldn't hear. Some women are just meant to be replaced. That was the day the sister I thought I had died. We simply never held a funeral for her. I cancelled the wedding, took a 2-year overseas assignment to Germany, and buried myself in my work. I cut off all communication with Victoria and kept my parents at a strict distance. Meanwhile, Victoria and Ryan got married a year later. They bought a modern house, posted photos of their perfect life, and became the golden couple my parents bragged about at every family dinner, while I was treated as the jilted, bitter sister who couldn't keep a man. The retirement dinner for our father, Colonel Richard Carter, was the first family event I had attended in 2 years. I had only agreed to come because my grandmother Eleanor, who had passed away 3 months prior, had left a specific instruction in her trust. Before she passed, Grandma Eleanor had handed me a sealed blue envelope. Hannah, she had said, her voice weak but her eyes sharp. Do not let them hide you in the shadows anymore. When your father retires, you wear your uniform. Let them see what true honor looks like. And remember, the envelope in my trust is for you when the time is right. I wore my formal white army dress uniform. I didn't wear it for attention, but to honor Grandma Eleanor's final wish. The pristine white fabric, the shining brass buttons, and the medals, including my Bronze Star and Army Commendation Medal, sat proudly on my chest. When I sat at the grand table, Victoria and Ryan were already there. Ryan looked older, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes avoiding mine the second I sat down. Victoria, wearing her vibrant emerald dress, was busy showing our aunts a photo of their new yacht. We're taking it to the San Juan Islands next weekend, Victoria boasted, her voice carrying across the table. Ryan's firm just closed a massive commercial deal. We're thinking of buying a vacation home there next. It's so exhausting being this busy, but success demands it. My mother leaned over, her eyes shining with admiration. You two really are our pride. Our family's legacy is in good hands. She didn't look at me. I was just the daughter who was away on deployments, the one who had failed to keep her man. Then came the toast. My father stood up, thanking his colleagues and his family. He looked at Victoria and Ryan, praising them for their support and their unwavering family values. And then, he turned his gaze to me. We're glad you could join us, Hannah, he said, his voice carrying a patronizing edge. Even if you're still choosing to keep yourself isolated from the family. We hope that one day you'll find a way to balance your career with a real life, instead of hiding behind your rank. Victoria seized the moment, raising her glass with a smirk. Well, Dad, maybe Hannah is just too intimidating for civilian men. A woman who commands an entire unit doesn't leave much room for a husband. Some people are just destined for the barracks. A few relatives laughed nervously. I took a slow sip of my water. I looked at Victoria, and for the first time in years, I didn't see a threat. I saw a woman who was exhausted from trying to prove she had won a prize that wasn't actually worth keeping. I set my glass down. Actually, Victoria, I said, my voice echoing clearly across the table. I'm not isolated. You're about to meet my husband. Victoria laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that cut through the room. Your husband? Since when do you have a husband, Hannah? You don't have to make up stories just because Ryan is sitting next to me. It's okay to be single. We won't judge you. Right then, the banquet doors opened. Dr. Thomas Whitaker stepped into the hall. He was the chief of trauma surgery at Seattle General, a brilliant medical mind, and a former lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve Medical Corps. More than that, he belonged to the Whitaker family, one of the most respected, philanthropic, and old-money dynasties in the Pacific Northwest. The silence that fell on the room was immediate. Several of my father's retired military colleagues and local business leaders recognized him instantly, their eyes widening in surprise. My father, Colonel Carter, stood up quickly, his face lighting up with social ambition. Dr. Whitaker. What an unexpected honor. What brings you to our family celebration? But Thomas didn't look at my father. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes locked onto mine, his face softening with the warm, genuine smile he only reserved for me. He walked straight past my father, straight to our table. I'm sorry I'm late, sweetheart, he said, resting his hand gently on my shoulder before leaning down to kiss my cheek. The surgical board meeting ran over, and traffic on I-5 was a nightmare. Victoria's hand shook violently. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The vintage champagne spread like a stain across the white tile, splashing onto the hem of her expensive designer dress. Thomas turned toward the sound. His eyes settled on Victoria, and his warm expression instantly turned into one of cold, professional recognition. Victoria? Thomas said, his voice flat, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. My mother gasped, looking between them. Thomas, you two know each other? Ryan looked between his wife and the prestigious surgeon, his face turning pale as he noticed the sheer, trembling terror in Victoria's eyes. Victoria, what's going on? Who is this man? How do you know him? Victoria couldn't speak. Her lips trembled, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The confident influencer, the sister who had spent her life taking things from me, was suddenly standing in front of the one man she had desperately tried, and failed, to control. Thomas looked at me, then at the silent table. His voice was calm, completely controlled, and carried the weight of absolute truth. Victoria and I dated briefly 5 years ago, Thomas explained, his tone completely flat. When I was completing my surgical fellowship in Chicago. Before I transferred to Seattle. Victoria closed her eyes, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the table. Ryan's voice was shaky, rising in pitch as suspicion turned into anger. Dated? Victoria, you told me you didn't know anyone in Chicago. You said you only went there for modeling gigs. We went out for a few months, Ryan, Thomas said, his voice steady. Until I realized Victoria was more interested in my family's foundation, my surname, and my bank account than an actual relationship. When I ended things, she didn't take rejection well. She actually attempted to leak fake engagement stories to the Chicago Society Press to force my hand. My family's legal team had to issue a formal cease and desist letter to her. The truth hung in the air, thick, heavy, and undeniable. Years ago, before Victoria had ever targeted Ryan, she had set her sights on Thomas. He was the ultimate prize, brilliant, wealthy, highly respected, and carrying a legacy name. She had thrown herself at him, trying to use her influencer status to climb into his world. But Thomas had seen through the facade. He had rejected her, calling her shallow and opportunistic, and walked away without looking back. Victoria's ego had been completely shattered. She couldn't handle the fact that a man had looked at her and deemed her unworthy. And in her panic to prove she was still desirable, she had returned home to Seattle and targeted the only man she knew she could easily take from me, Ryan. Ryan wasn't her great love. He was her consolation prize. He was the tool she used to heal her bruised vanity and hurt me in the process, to prove to herself and our parents that she could still win against her sister. Ryan stood up slowly, looking at his wife as if she were a complete stranger. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "You used me," Ryan whispered, his voice cracking with humiliation in front of the entire family and the high society guests. "All this time, you held this marriage over Hannah's head. You made me buy this house, this yacht, all to show off. But you only wanted me because you couldn't have him. I was just your backup plan to save your pride." Victoria reached for his arm, her voice desperate and shrill. "Ryan, no, please. That was years ago. It didn't mean anything. I love you." "Don't touch me," Ryan hissed, pushing her hand away. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor, then back at her. "Our entire marriage is a lie." In front of everyone, Ryan pulled his wedding band off his finger, threw it onto the table, grabbed his coat, and stormed out of the banquet hall. Victoria let out a choked sob and ran after him, her emerald dress trailing through the spilled champagne on the floor. My parents sat in stunned, horrified silence. The golden couple they had built their social pride upon had collapsed in a matter of minutes. I didn't stay to watch the rest of the family drama unfold. I had no desire to watch my parents try to piece together the ruins of their social standing. Thomas and I quietly left the country club, walking out into the cool, fresh night air. As we drove home along the waterfront, the city lights reflecting off the dark, peaceful water of the Puget Sound, I looked at the simple, elegant gold band on my left ring finger. Thomas reached over, wrapping his warm hand around mine, squeezing it gently. "You did great tonight, Captain," he said softly. "Thanks to you, Doctor," I replied, smiling. "I only spoke the truth," Thomas said, looking at me with deep respect. "You earned your place, Hannah. They just couldn't see it because they were too busy looking at shadows." I realized then that the opposite of revenge isn't forgiveness. It's freedom. For 5 years, I had carried the weight of my sister's betrayal like a physical scar, thinking I was the one who had lost. But standing beside Thomas, I realized that Ryan's departure was the greatest rescue of my life. If Ryan hadn't left, I would have married a man who was easily swayed, who didn't respect my strength, and who wanted a shadow instead of a partner. Because of that betrayal, I took that overseas assignment. I grew as an officer, met Thomas during a joint military medical relief mission, and built a life based on mutual respect, honor, and true, deep love. Victoria had taken my past, but she had never touched my future. That was always mine to build. If you also believe that some losses are actually rescues in disguise, and that your worth is defined by the peace you build rather than the validation of others, leave one word in the comments below. Free.